The box arrived on a Tuesday. It was a plain gray container, military issue, no bigger than a travel trunk. Two colonial officers carried it up the dirt road into Redmore Village with their caps in their hands and their eyes fixed straight ahead. Everyone who saw them knew what it meant before they ever knocked on a door. Corporal Dara Voss was coming home, just not the way anyone had hoped. His sister Myra stood on the porch of the house they had shared since childhood and watched the officers walk toward her. She did not cry. She had already done that 3 nights ago, when the message first came through on the village communicator in the middle of the night. She had cried until there was nothing left. Now she just felt hollowed out, like an old tree that looks fine from the outside but has nothing inside anymore. Elder Rowan Hale stood beside her. He was a tall man, past 70, with a soldier's posture that age had never fully taken from him. He had served in 2 campaigns before settling in Redmore. He put a hand briefly on Myra's shoulder and said nothing. That was how Rowan showed that something mattered. The village gathered for the funeral 2 days later. All of Redmore came, the farmers from the eastern fields, the miners from the lower slopes, the children who had grown up knowing Dara as the young man who always had time for a game or a joke. They stood in the ceremonial grounds at the edge of the village, where the highland wind moved through the long grass quietly, and the mountains sat in the distance like witnesses. Dara had died in the outer reach, a campaign against the Gret Dominion that most people in Redmore only knew from news reports and worry. He had volunteered at 19 and served for 4 years. His official record said he was decorated twice for valor. Myra could have told anyone who asked exactly what he was like before all that, before the uniform and the medals. He used to leave bread out on the fence post for the birds every morning. He was afraid of deep water. He laughed too loud at his own jokes. She stood at the front of the crowd and held these things carefully in her mind. Cinder sat beside her. That was unusual, because Cinder usually stayed near the back of any crowd. The hatchling was 5 years old now, small by whatever standards its species used, roughly the size of a large sheepdog, with deep violet scales that caught light in ways that did not make complete sense. Nobody in Redmore was exactly sure what kind of creature it was. They had found the egg near the ruins of an old Gret battlefield 5 years ago, half buried in ash and completely abandoned. Dr. Noel Arden had identified it as a dragon-class species, which told them almost nothing useful. He had also said it probably wouldn't survive. He was wrong about that. Redmore raised it the way the village raised most things together, and with a stubborn refusal to give up on something just because it was difficult. Children fed it scraps. Farmers let it sleep in the barn on cold nights. Myra and Dara had been the ones who sat with it through its first winter, when it was sick and small and made a low sound that made it impossible to sleep. Dara used to say it chose them. Myra used to say they had no choice. Now Cinder sat pressed against Myra's leg, its golden eyes fixed on the gray box at the center of the ceremony. Elder Rowan spoke. He said the things that needed to be said, that Dara was brave, that he served with honor, that the village was proud and heartbroken in equal measure. The colonial anthem played from a small speaker. The ceremonial horn was raised. When the horn sounded, Cinder lifted its head. The sound it made was nothing like anything Myra had heard from it before. It was not the low hum it made when content. It was not the sharp warning sound it used when sensing something wrong. This was layered and deep and resonant, multiple tones woven together into something that rose and fell like music. It filled the grounds and moved out across the highland grass and did not stop for nearly 2 minutes. When it ended, the silence that followed felt different from ordinary silence. Myra looked around. Elder Rowan's face, which she had never seen break in 30 years of knowing him, was wet. Old Breck Donal, the surveyor who maintained an expression of permanent, unimpressed practicality in all known situations, had both hands pressed against his mouth. Even the children were still. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Myra looked down at Cinder. The hatchling lowered its head slowly, then turned. It walked away from the crowd, through the grass, to the northeast edge of the village. It stopped there, facing the old Gret battlefield ruins that lay somewhere beyond the fields in the distance, and it stood very still. Myra watched it from across the grounds. The ceremony continued around her. People moved and spoke quietly and paid their respects. The box was carried with care. But Cinder did not come back. When everything was over and the crowd had gone home and the light was going orange across the mountains, Myra was still standing on her porch watching the hatchling at the edge of the village. It had not moved in 3 hours. It was looking at something in the northeast, something she could not see. She told herself it was grief. She did not yet know how wrong she was. Nobody in Redmore talked much about what Cinder had done at the funeral. They mentioned it the way people mention things that are too large to carry in conversation, briefly, carefully, and then they set it down and moved on. There was too much grief in the village for one more mystery to sit on top of it. But Myra noticed. She noticed because grief had taken her sleep away, and when a person cannot sleep, they notice everything. She was awake before dawn on the first morning after the funeral when she heard Cinder leave the barn. The hatchling moved quietly for its size, but the latch on the barn door had a specific sound, and Myra knew it. She pulled on her coat and followed. Cinder walked northeast, straight and steady without hesitation, like something being pulled on a string. It crossed the back fence at the edge of the village property, moved through the long grass beyond, and stopped at a flat piece of open ground roughly 40 meters past the fence line. Then it sat. It tilted its head to one side, and it waited. Myra stood back and watched. She did not know what she was watching. After an hour, Cinder stood, turned, walked back to the barn, and went inside without making a sound. She told herself it was strange. She wrote the coordinates down in the small field journal she kept in her coat pocket from her days helping her brother survey the highland terrain. Then she went back inside and tried to sleep. The next morning, Cinder did the same thing. Exact same path, exact same spot, exact same head tilt. Myra watched again, and this time she stayed longer and looked more carefully. The ground at that spot was flat and heavily overgrown, unremarkable by any measure. There was no water source, no animal trail, no reason she could name for a creature to stand there every morning before the sun was fully up. She went to Dr. Noel Arden on the 3rd day. Arden was the closest thing Redmore had to a scientist. He was a physician first, but he had spent 20 years quietly collecting data on non-human species he encountered in his travels before settling in the village, and his office was stacked with reference materials that the nearest city library would have been glad to own. He listened to Myra carefully, asked her to describe the cry from the funeral a second time, and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long while. He examined Cinder that afternoon. The hatchling allowed it, which was not always guaranteed. Arden spent a long time around the area of Cinder's throat and chest, pressing gently, listening. When he was done, he washed his hands and turned to Myra with an expression she did not entirely like. "It has 2 vocal chambers," he said. "Most creatures its class only have 1. The second one, the deeper one, was not active until this week. Whatever it produced at the funeral came from there." He pulled a thin reference file from his shelf and opened it on the table. His notes on dragon-class species were sparse, because information on them was sparse. The Gret Dominion had not been generous about sharing what they knew, and almost everything that had been independently documented predated the expansion. What Arden had was old and partial and full of gaps. But one note, circled in red ink at some earlier point, read, "Secondary harmonic vocalization, function unknown, observed only in specimens designated sovereign lineage. All sovereign lineages believed extinct." Myra read it twice. "What's a sovereign lineage?" she asked. "I don't know." Arden said, "I circled it because I didn't know. That was 6 years ago and I still don't." Myra took the reference number from the file and spent that evening on the village communicator searching for anything connected to it. She found almost nothing. There were fragments in pre-Dominion xenobiology records, mostly corrupted or incomplete. There was one partial Gret military document, an inventory note, badly damaged, that contained a single readable line. She read it 4 times to be sure she was reading it correctly. It said, "Primary archive installation, sealed prior to first Gret expansion. Activation requires sovereign class voice print. All sovereign lineages believed terminated." She sat with that sentence in the dark for a long time. The word terminated sat in her chest like something cold. Meanwhile, Rowan Hale had quietly authorized a ground survey of the northeast field after Myra brought the coordinates to him the previous day. He had not explained why to anyone, simply told Breck Donal that he wanted to know what was under that patch of land. Breck ran a standard geological scan the next morning and came back with an expression that did not match his usual flat calm. The ground composition was wrong. The soil had normal readings down to 2 meters. Below that, the density shifted in a way that soil did not naturally shift. At 6 meters down, the scanner had returned a pattern, not a random pattern, a geometric one, straight lines, right angles, regular spacing, the kind of formations that do not exist in nature. Rowan read the scan results and called Myra. Myra was already at his door. She had the field journal open in one hand and the partial Gret document on her communicator screen in the other. And she had not slept in 2 days, and she had exactly 1 sentence to say. "Cinder isn't grieving," she said. "It's been telling us where to dig." They started digging on the 5th day after the funeral. Rowan kept the group small, 6 people. Himself, Myra, Dr. Arden, Breck Donal with the survey equipment, and 2 strong-backed farmers named Will and Corin who were told only that they were helping with a ground inspection. Rowan had spent decades making hard decisions carefully, and this felt like the kind of situation where careful was the only responsible speed. Cinder walked to the site without being led. It sat at the edge of the marked ground, watched the first shovel break earth, and did not move. The first meter was ordinary soil, dark and rich and cold from the highland ground. The second meter was harder, with more rock mixed in, and Breck switched to mechanical tools. By the 3rd meter, the soil composition had changed enough that Breck made a quiet comment about it not being right. The 4th meter took most of the morning. At 3 meters and 80 centimeters, Will's tool hit something that did not sound like rock. Everyone stopped. Breck crouched at the edge of the pit and ran a handheld scanner slowly over the surface. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That is not any material I have a reading for." They cleared the surrounding soil by hand after that, working carefully and slowly. What emerged was a surface, smooth, dark, slightly reflective, that curved gently at the edges as they followed it outward. The structure beneath the field was a sealed capsule of some kind, roughly circular, at least 8 meters across. The material had no visible seams except for one, a single line that ran in a slow arc across the top of the vault, its edges cut so precisely they caught light like a blade. No rust, no degradation. Whatever it was, it had been down there for a very long time and it had not changed at all. Arden photographed everything and said nothing, which was how he behaved when something was beyond his existing categories. Myra stood at the edge of the pit and looked at the geometric patterns on the surface, low relief markings, almost like writing, but not any script she recognized. They matched nothing from the Gret files she had been reading. They were older. She could feel that without being able to explain it. Cinder stood up. It walked to the edge of the pit, looked down at the vault surface for a long moment, and then it cried. 3 tones this time, short and deliberate with a pause between each one. Not the long, mourning sound from the funeral. These were precise, intentional, spaced like a sentence. The vault responded. A thin line of light appeared along the arc-shaped seam, pale gold in the morning shadow of the pit. It pulsed slowly, 3 times, and stopped. The geometric markings on either side of the seam lit briefly and went dark again. Nobody in the pit said anything. Will and Corin had backed up against the far wall of the excavation. Breck was staring at his scanner, which had gone from no reading to a reading he couldn't interpret, and his hands had stopped moving. Arden was the first to find words. "The pulse pattern," he said, and his voice was very steady in a way that meant he was working hard to keep it that way, "matches the tonal structure of what Cinder just produced. The vault is not reacting to us." "It's reacting to Cinder," Myra said. "Yes." She pulled out her communicator and brought up the Gret inventory fragment again. She read the single surviving line aloud to the group, standing at the edge of a pit that contained something the galaxy had forgotten about. Primary archive installation, sealed prior to first Gret expansion. Activation requires sovereign-class voice print. All sovereign lineages believed terminated. The silence that followed was the kind that comes when a group of people all reach the same conclusion at the same moment, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Rowan looked at Cinder. Cinder was still standing at the edge of the pit, looking down at the vault, perfectly calm. The golden eyes did not blink. "It's not the last of its kind in the way we thought," Myra said. "It's not just a stray. It's the last of a specific line, a line that the Gret hunted." "Hunted because of this," Arden said, gesturing at the vault. "Because of what's inside this," Myra corrected. Rowan straightened up. He looked at the vault and at Cinder and at the mountains on the horizon, and then he made a decision in the way he always made decisions, quietly, without announcing that he was making one. "Nobody speaks about this outside this group," he said. "Not tonight. I need to send a signal to the colonial authority, and I need to do it before anyone else does. Whatever is down there has been sealed for longer than this colony has existed, and I want to be the one who decides who gets told." He looked at Myra. "Can you keep it calm?" Myra looked at Cinder. The hatchling turned its head and looked back at her with an expression that was, as always, entirely unreadable. But it had walked to this spot every morning for 5 days. It had cried at the funeral. It had called back to something underground like it was answering a question no one else could hear. "It's been calm this whole time," Myra said. "It's us that needed to catch up." The shuttle came down at first light on the 6th day. It landed in the highland field east of the village with the kind of precision that expensive equipment produces, and the woman who stepped out of it looked like someone whose entire life had prepared her for controlled situations. She was tall and narrow-shouldered, with the gray-blue skin and triple-jointed fingers that identified her as Veth, a species known throughout the Galactic Union for careful diplomacy and a preference for written agreements over verbal ones. Her name was Peta Sworn. Her title was Liaison Officer, Union Frontier Desk, Eastern Colonies. She had been told there was an archaeological irregularity in a small highland village on Ashen Vale. She had brought 2 aides and a standard survey kit, and the calm confidence of someone who expected to be home by the end of the week. Rowan met her at the field and walked her to the excavation site without small talk. He had been a soldier. He understood that some situations did not benefit from slow introductions. Peta Sworn saw the vault and stopped walking. Her aides bumped into her from behind. One of them made a sound. Peta herself went very still in the way that certain people go still when their mind is working faster than their body can keep up with. She looked at the material of the vault's surface, then at the geometric markings, then at the seam along the top where the pale gold light had pulsed the day before. "Where did you find information pointing you here?" she asked. Her voice was controlled, but her fingers had tightened around the strap of her survey kit. Rowan nodded at Cinder. Peta Sworn looked at the hatchling for a long moment. "That is a dragon class," she said. "Yes," said Arden. "Secondary harmonic vocalization." Everyone in the group looked at her. Arden said, "You know what that means." "I know what it means," she said quietly. She set down her survey kit, crouched at the edge of the pit and looked at the vault for a long time in silence. Then she stood and turned to Rowan with an expression that had lost all of its professional distance. "I need to contact my office. I need to do it now. And then I need to explain something to all of you." What she explained, in a flat and careful voice while standing in the Highland wind, was this. The vault was pre-Dominion construction. The material, which she had recognized immediately, was called Ardeny composite, a substance that no civilization currently operating could reproduce, because the civilization that created it had been gone for over 200 years. They were called the Ardeny. They had existed across a wide region of space before the Gret rose to power, and when the Gret began their expansion, the Ardeny were among the first to be removed. The Gret did not like to leave records of what they removed, and so most of the galaxy had only a vague idea the Ardeny had ever existed at all. The Ardeny had built archives, sealed vaults distributed across dozens of worlds, filled with everything they knew and everything they had witnessed. The Galactic Union had been aware of 47 confirmed archive locations for over a century. None had ever opened, because the Ardeny had designed them with a single key, a living key, and the Gret had spent 50 years hunting that key to extinction. The sovereign lineage dragons. Peta Sworn looked at Cinder again when she said this, and something in her expression was difficult to describe. It was not quite guilt. It was the face of someone who understood, suddenly and fully, the size of what they were standing next to. "The Union searched," she said. "We searched for survivors. We believed, as the record suggested, that there were none." Myra said, "You were wrong." "Yes." Myra looked at Cinder. She thought about a winter 5 years ago when the hatchling had been small and sick, and the village had sat with it in shifts because no one could stand the thought of it dying alone. She thought about Dara bringing it scraps and talking to it in a low voice about nothing in particular. She thought about the funeral, and the sound, and the 5 mornings following a creature that had been trying to show them something. "It chose this," she said, not to Peta, to herself mostly. The liaison officer contacted her office. The conversation was brief, and from Peta's side of it, almost entirely composed of the phrase, "I understand what I am telling you." She came back to the group and said, "We need to open it now, before anyone else arrives who might complicate the process. The Union will have a vessel in orbit within 18 hours. So will the Gret Dominion, once the signal is intercepted. Whatever is inside that vault should be witnessed by this village before it is witnessed by anyone else." Rowan looked at Myra. Myra looked at Cinder. Cinder had already moved to the edge of the pit. It looked down at the vault and produced 3 tones, the same 3 tones from the day before, clean and deliberate and resonant. The seam of the vault ran with gold light. The markings on the surface lit in a slow sequence, row after row, like a long sentence being read aloud. A sound came from inside the vault, not mechanical, not alarm, a low hum, steady and welcoming. Then the seam split open, and the light from inside was not the pale gold of the exterior. It was warm and full and everywhere at once. Myra was the first human to step inside. Word traveled faster than Rowan had hoped. Within 48 hours of the vault opening, 3 Galactic Union vessels were in orbit above Ashen Vale. A Gret Dominion warship arrived 22 hours after that and held position at the outer edge of the system, making no aggressive moves but not leaving either. The Colonial Authority dispatched a legal team by emergency transport. 2 academic institutions filed priority access, requests that Peta Sworn quietly set aside without answering. Down in Redmore, the population of 400 found themselves at the center of an attention they had done nothing to seek and had no particular framework for handling. Inside the archive, the air was warm and still. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with crystalline spires roughly the height of a person, each one faintly lit from within. There were hundreds of them. The light they produced was steady and even, and it made the space feel less like a vault and more like a library that had been waiting patiently for someone to come back. Peta Sworn stood in the middle of it and did not speak for a very long time. When she finally did, she said to no one in particular, "There are 47 known archive sites. This is the first to open in recorded history." A Union specialist team arrived by the second day and began a careful inventory. They worked slowly and treated everything with the kind of reverence that professionals show when they know they are handling something that cannot be replaced. Myra stayed with them. She had not been asked to stay. She was not a scientist or a diplomat or an official of any kind. But no one told her to leave, and Cinder stayed close to her, and the archive seemed to have decided that Cinder had access, which by extension meant Myra had access too. What the specialists found inside the data spires was documented over 3 days and transmitted, in encrypted segments, to the Union High Council. The territorial records were the first thing to create a political crisis. The Ardeni had kept detailed legal documentation of which species held rights to which systems under pre-Dominion law, and the records were precise, dated, and signed by representatives of dozens of civilizations. 14 star systems currently under Gret control appeared in those records as belonging to other species. 3 of those systems contained human colonies, settlements established after the Gret had offered them in a treaty, the Redmore Treaty of 2241, which had been accepted in good faith. The humans who signed it had not known the Gret had taken those systems illegally and had no right to offer them to anyone. The Gret warship at the edge of the system continued to hold position and say nothing. The biological records were the second discovery. 311 species, some extinct and some nearly so, had complete genetic and medical documentation preserved in the archive. There were species the Union had believed completely lost. The data was intact, all of it. The engineering files were the third. Schematics for an energy infrastructure that current galactic technology could not replicate, clean, scalable, no waste. The specialists who reviewed them sat quietly for a long time before they said anything. But it was the fourth discovery that changed everything in a way that none of the others had. Deep in the archive, in a sealed secondary chamber that only opened when Cinder cried against its door, was a legal document. The specialists called it the Ardeni Covenant. It was a formal instrument, witnessed and signed, establishing that any species which raised a sovereign lineage dragon freely, not as a prisoner, not as a tool, not in captivity, would be recognized as a covenant steward. The covenant stewardship carried specific legal rights under pre-Dominion galactic law. The right to speak without interruption in Union Council chambers, the right to review all territorial agreements involving sovereign class designations, and the right to formal arbitration in any dispute where Ardeni records were presented as evidence. The Union still recognized pre-Dominion law as its foundational framework. It had always done so as a formality because none of it had ever been applicable. The Ardeni were gone. The vaults were sealed. The dragons were extinct. Until a village of 400 people on a frontier world found an abandoned egg and decided it needed a home. Peta Sworn transmitted the covenant documentation to the High Council and requested an emergency session. The Council's response came back in 6 hours, confirmed and recognized. Humanity, specifically by way of Redmore Village and Cinder, was now a covenant steward species under galactic law. The Gret warship received the news and went completely silent. It did not leave, but it did not speak either, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Peta Sworn found Myra outside the archive that evening, sitting on the ground with Cinder beside her, watching the sky. "The Council would like to know," Peta said carefully, "if Redmore Village has a formal representative, someone who can speak on behalf of humanity in the stewardship proceedings." Myra thought about that. She looked at her field journal, at the pages of early morning notes about a dragon that stood in a field and tilted its head. "I'm not a politician," she said. "No," Peta agreed. "That may be exactly why they asked." Myra looked up at the 3 Union ships in orbit, faint points of light against the early stars. Then she looked at Cinder, who looked back with gold eyes that held no urgency. Only the same steady waiting the hatchling had carried since the morning after the funeral, as if it had always known the village would eventually understand. "Ask Rowan," Myra said. "He's the one who authorized the dig." 2 weeks after the funeral, the rain came back to Redmore. It rained the way it always rained in the Highlands, quietly, persistently, without drama, turning the dirt roads to soft mud and collecting in the low spots of every field. The mountains disappeared into gray cloud. The village smelled of wet grass and wood smoke. Rowan called the village together in the square, not an official assembly. He sent no formal notice. He simply walked to each door himself, the way he had always done for things that mattered, and said the same thing at each one. "Come to the square this evening, there is something you should hear." They came. All of them, or close enough to all that the difference did not matter. They stood in the square in their coats with the rain falling soft around them, and Rowan stood on the low stone step where he had addressed the village for 30 years and read the Galactic Union certification aloud. He got halfway through. He stopped, cleared his throat, started again at the same line and stopped at the same word. He folded the document carefully and looked out at the crowd for a moment, and then he said, "Humanity is a covenant steward species. We have been formally recognized under predominion galactic law. What that means in plain terms is that when human representatives speak in Union Council chambers, every species present is legally required to listen." He put the document in his coat pocket. Nobody said anything. The rain kept falling. A child somewhere in the back coughed. The wood smoke drifted across the square from the bakery chimney and mixed with the cold air. A few people looked at each other. Most just stood there holding the sentence Rowan had just said, trying to find somewhere to put it. Breck Donal was the first one to speak. He was standing near the front, still in his work coat, with mud on his boots. He looked at Cinder, who was sitting in the center of the square in the rain without appearing to mind it, and he said, "We just raised it. We fed it and kept it warm, and we just took care of it." He said it the way a person says something when they are not talking to anyone in particular, when they are really just saying it out loud, because it is too large to keep entirely inside. Nobody disagreed with him, because that was exactly it. Nobody in Redmore had taken Cinder in because they expected anything. Nobody had known what it was. Nobody had calculated that a sick dragon egg found in a field of ash would grow into the last living key to the most important sealed archive in galactic history. They had just taken care of it, because it needed taking care of, because that was what you did. Across the galaxy, the response to the Union's announcement was enormous and fast. 14 species whose territorial rights had been violated sent formal alliance inquiries to human colonial authority within a day. 2 species who had previously treated human diplomatic communications with open contempt went quiet. 3 academic institutions that had been dismissive of human research for decades suddenly found their correspondence very polite. The Gret Dominion entered negotiations. They did not admit wrongdoing in those first days, but they entered the room, and that was a thing that had not happened in the previous 40 years of attempts. Myra heard all of this through Peta Sworn's updates, delivered each morning at the edge of the archive site where the liaison officer had made herself a kind of field office. She listened, asked occasional questions, and went on doing what she had been doing since the vault opened, staying near Cinder and writing things down. On the 14th day, she walked to the ceremonial grounds. She stood at Dara's grave for a while without saying anything. The headstone was simple, colony standard, with his name and dates, and the colonial service emblem. The earth above him was still fresh. The rain had darkened it. Around it, the other graves of Redmore's dead stood in their rows, soldiers and farmers and ordinary people who had built an ordinary village on a frontier world and never expected to be particularly significant. She thought about what Dara would have said about all of it. He found most official things faintly absurd, and most small things genuinely important. He would have been more interested in the fact that Cinder was eating well again than in any galactic legal certification. She thought that was the right way to look at it. Cinder came and stood beside the grave. It had been doing this every day, and Myra had stopped finding it strange. The hatchling lifted its head and cried, the long, layered, harmonic cry from the funeral, the one that had started all of this. Out across the highland fields it went, over the open vault, up into the cloud-heavy sky where Union ships still held their respectful orbit. It lasted 2 minutes, maybe a little more. When it ended, Myra stood in the rain and thought about the fact that an orphaned creature had cried at a funeral and changed the standing of the human species in the known galaxy. And the reason it worked was not because anyone was clever or powerful or had a plan. The reason it worked was that a village found something lost and chose, without calculating the cost, to make it feel at home. She put her hand on Cinder's back. The hatchling leaned into it slightly, the way it always did, and the two of them stood there in the rain and the quiet while the galaxy sorted out what had happened. They stayed until the light went,